All doing? It's good to see everybody here tonight, and let me go over what this is about. We're just going to tell some stories for the next 45 minutes. Hope to have a good time, and if you want to get up, get some coffee, or go to the bathroom, or whatever, just feel free, sit back, relax, and we'll talk a little about this great organization known as Alcoholics Anonymous that you and I are lucky enough to be in. And I'm sure none of us ever thought we'd be saying that before we got here. Boy, I hope someday I'm lucky enough to get an AA. And maybe I can put it on my resume, and then when I go for a job interview, I'll get a better job. But we really are lucky, and we've talked about this in the past, that only about 1 in 10 alcoholics find Alcoholics Anonymous. So that means that 90% of those of us with this disease die from the disease, either drunk driving and kill somebody or kill somebody else, or mentally insane, liver damage, and it's just a terrible way to go. It just gets worse and worse and worse. So we're the chosen few, and as a result, we have an obligation to pass this on to the next person who's coming along. That's the only thing I think that's asked of us, is to try and take somebody else who's in total darkness and grab their hand and pull them out and take them down the path that you've already found. We started a little bit about the history of AA. We were talking about the cast of characters that was up in Manchester, Vermont in the early 1900s, and how that all blossomed, and Ebby and Dr. Carl Jung and so on down. Tonight I'm going to just talk a little bit about the co-founders themselves and the beginning, of AA and how it got started. Both of our co-founders were born in Vermont. I'm from New England, so I take great pleasure in the fact that this huge spiritual, social movement that is now spread all over the world did not start in California. And because it seems like everything starts in California, and here we got two guys from Vermont. When you think of big drinking states, do you think of Vermont? I mean, I don't. And Dr. Bob was about 15, 16 years older than Bill, and he was born in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, about 1879. He'd be about 120 years old now if he were still alive. And he knew what he wanted to be when he was a young man. He wanted to be a doctor. And he attended local prep school, went on to Dartmouth, got out of Dartmouth, went to Michigan to medical school, started drinking there, and sort of got screwed up for a couple of years and had to take some extra courses, but he finally got through that. His father was a judge, family, solid all the way. And he got an internship in City Hospital in Akron, Ohio, and that's how he ended up in Akron, Ohio. As his practice developed, he married a gal that he met in St. Johnsbury, Ann, and as his practice developed, the people liked him in the city, really thought he was a wonderful guy, but they thought he drank too much. And he would run into situations that were embarrassing to him. He liked church. He was very spiritually oriented, so he wanted to do something about it. And as we talked about earlier, this Oxford movement was all over the place. And he and his wife both got involved in that. And he was just there on a very regular basis. He was there all the time. And he got everything down in terms of spirituality, except the not drinking part. That was the one part that he never really got a handle on. And so it was very frustrating to the people around him that Dr. Bob, they knew how hard he was trying, just couldn't make it. And so he was attending these meetings, but was just drunk, until 1935, when this character from New York came out by the name of Bill Wilson, who was also born in Vermont, in East Dorset, Vermont, and he was the only child of a man who was a miner, a quarry slate and marble and that kind of stuff, and his mother was a very independent person who later divorced His father went on to become a doctor, very unusual for women back in those days, very independent. And Bill grew up with the sense of isolation. He liked to prove things to himself. A lot of his time he was taken care of by his grandfather, who was an alcoholic who had a spiritual awakening, very similar to Bill's, and never drank again. He was just up on a mountain outside of East Dorset and had this white flash and noise and all that, and then just never drank again. But Bill was around a lot of alcohol and was felt very insecure, even though he had more talent than most people. He was tall, good-looking, great athlete, good student, but he just felt like, I'm nobody. And so he always had to prove himself, and in our history books, there's a wonderful story of his grandfather telling him one day when he was about 12 or 13 years old. He said, you know, the people from Australia are the only ones in the world that have ever made a boomerang that comes back. Now, that was the wrong thing to tell to Bill Wilson, because he said to himself, the people from Australia are the only people as of yet who have built a boomerang that will come back. So he took a headboard out of the bed, went out and carved it and worked on it in total obsession for about 4 months. And then called his grandfather out one day and said, watch. And it came back. And that was sort of, when I read that story, I went, okay, this guy is like me. I could really connect with this. Just have to be number one, that total thing to overcome the feeling that you're nobody. And he was attending a military academy when World War I broke out. He went overseas and fought in France, came back, married Lois that we talked about, Lois Burnham, went off to New York to earn his fame and fortune. And while down there, he worked in insurance business. He attended night school to become a lawyer, Brooklyn Law College, and got 3 years in, never really got a law degree, but had a great deal of background in law, and went to Wall Street and came up with the idea of going out and personally investigating up-and-coming companies, which hadn't been done at that time on Wall Street. And so he and Lois had you look in the book, they got a picture of the motorcycle they had with a sidecar, tents and camping equipment and all that, and then boom, there they are, tearing around the countryside. And he came across Eastman Kodak when it was in its infancy, and he'd be drinking with some of the employees down at the local bar and make very good friends, and they'd say, hey, would you like to come into our experimental labs and see what we got? And he'd go, yeah. And he'd go in there, and then he'd write up these reports, and these reports started getting, General Electric was another company. These reports were so good that the people on Wall Street would say, man, you go get these things, we'll let you share in the action. We'll give you part of the stuff here just for the information. You say, oh man, he's starting to roll. He's joining the country clubs, playing golf, drinking, just having this wonderful time. And of course his alcoholism catches up, as it does with all of us. And pretty soon he's not showing up. He's not reliable. Well, he's great when he's sober, but I don't think I could trust him with this deal. Into a hospital, detox, first encounter with Dr. Silkworth in Towns Hospital. And but he's just going to, do it himself. And he struggled so hard with this disease, trying to beat it himself, and just kept going down and down and down, and ended up where Lois was working, and he was stealing money to buy gin, to put a big deal together so they could all get rich and everything would be fine, and down. And finally Dr. Silkworth told Lois, if this happens again, we're going to have to lock him up forever, which is what they did with alcoholics to prevent them from killing themselves. And it was at that stage in his drinking that he had that call from Ebby Thatcher that we talked about, and Ebby talked to him about a higher power and this Oxford movement, and Bill went back in the hospital and had this big spiritual awakening and came roaring out of the hospital, totally free from his alcohol problem, with a commitment to sober up all the drunks in the world. So he started in the bars, And he just said, I've got to get him. That was what he worked for the first 6 months. He just said, I'm going to sober up drunks because I'm sober and I got all this to offer. And he'd go into a bar and start talking to these guys and going, you don't have to sit here and be drunk all the time. You don't have to have these terrible things. Listen to me. I was sitting in Towns Hospital, sitting there one night. I was totally hopeless. I said, God, help me, and the sky opened up, and the mountaintop was there. And I was up there and heard the winds and the beautiful music of the angels. And the drunks would look at him and go, well, that happens to me when I drink rum. And nobody was paying any attention whatsoever. Month after month, and nobody getting sober. And he complained one night to Lois. He said, you know, this just isn't working. He said, I try day after day after day, and nobody is getting it. He said, I think this is a total waste of time. Nothing is happening. And she made a very interesting observation. She said, Bill, you're staying sober. And he kind of tucked that away. Well, there came a time when, because of his newfound sobriety, the Wall Streeters started trusting him again, because he was sharp. And they said, Bill, we got a deal. There's a manufacturing company, manufacture rubber out in Akron, Ohio. And it's a machine tool company that built stuff for manufacturing rubber tires and that kind of stuff. And they're having a big proxy fight out there. And if you can go out there and swing it to our side, we'll make you the president of the company with a bunch of stock and a good salary. And so he just went, I knew it was going to happen. I knew this was going to happen. Went out there and poured his heart into it. Took his last dollars. Checked in the Mayflower Hotel and worked on this proxy fight. And boom, they have the vote. And the other side wins. And he loses. And it is a late weekend in May in 1935. And he's pacing up and down the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel. The big deal just fell through. He doesn't have enough money to check out of his room. And he's thinking about what he ought to do about this, and he's standing there and he can hear the people in the bar off of the lobby. And it really crossed his mind that he ought to go in there and get some gin and be, as he said, king for a day. You know, just something to relieve this. And all of a sudden, and many people say, this is when AA was given to us by our higher power, the thought occurred to him that he better go find another drunk to work with for him to stay sober. For Bill to stay sober. It just said, you know, if I don't go find another drunk to work with, I may get drunk. So his eyes went over to the list of church directories, and he called a Reverend Walter Tunks, who became part of AA history and said the graveside service at Dr. Bob's funeral. He told him who he was. I'm a drunk from New York. I'm looking for other drunks. And he said, well, I can't give you directly, but I'll give you a list of names of people in the Oxford movement. I'm sure they can connect. And he gave him about 8, 9 names, and he called one after the other. He's on vacation. No, I don't want to talk to a guy from New York who's a drunk, and blah, blah, blah. And he gets down to the last name, which was Henrietta Seiberling. And, you know, the Seiberling was connected with the Goodyear, huge millionaire families. And Henrietta was in the Oxford group. And in her obituary, they came out with some stories, and her version of this was that they knew that Dr. Bob was an alcoholic in the Oxford group, and that they had, but they couldn't say anything to him until you admit it. You had to confess. And this went on for years, and finally one day at the meeting, you know, he goes, well, I want to confess something a lot of you may not know. And they're, you know, like... Yeah, well, yeah, we won't know a thing about that. I am an alcoholic. I have this terrible drinking problem. And at that point, the group members would pray for a month for an answer to this problem. And it was about the third week and a half in this month period when the phone rings, and it's Bill Wilson calling, Henrietta Seiberling, the last name on the list. Says, hi, I'm a drunk from New York. I think I found a cure for alcoholism. Do you know anybody that I could work with? And she said, we've been expecting your call. Now there's some faith, right? So off he goes to the gatehouse of the big mansion, the Cyberling mansion, Stan Hewitt. And where she was living, she had just divorced one of the Cyberling's sons, and she had the gatehouse and was living there. Gets over there and talks to her, and she said, "Oh my God, I got the perfect guy, Dr. Bob Smith. He's in our group, and I'm going to call him right now." And blah, blah, blah. It was the Saturday before Mother's Day. And he calls up Ann, or she calls up Ann, said, "Ann, I got a man from New York, blah, blah, blah. It's the man. This is it. Get Dr. Bob over here." And Ann said, "Well, I don't think Dr. Bob can come over right now. It seems that tomorrow's Mother's Day, and he went out this morning bright and early to get me a Mother's Day plant. And he and the plant are under the table right now. So we're going to have to wait until tomorrow." So AA had to wait another day. Dr. Bob wakes up. He's all hungover. It's Sunday, feeling terrible, and here's his wife going, "Oh, we got this guy from New York, and you're going to go..." He's going, "Oh, all right. So they set this meeting for 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He said, "I'll give him 10 minutes." As they drove up, and they talked for 5 hours. There was that instant magic that happens when one drunk is talking to another, and the beginnings of AA had started. The connection was immediate. Dr. Bob had never talked to anybody who knew how he felt and knew what he thought, and it was just like, I can't believe this. And so they said, "Well, we're just going to stay together and work on this." And Bill's going, "Great, because I don't have enough room to stay in the hotel, so I'll stay in your house." And he did. And he stayed there for a few weeks, and Dr. Bob came in with 2 or 3 weeks of sobriety and said, "Well, now that I've been sober a while, I realize that I have been neglecting my medical knowledge. And there's a big medical convention in Atlantic City, and I have a thirst for knowledge. And I'm going to go to the convention." So Dr. Bob did us the favor of having AA's first slip and went off to the convention and got roaring drunk, came back, and they dumped him off at the wrong train station in Ohio, and somebody else had to go over and get him from there and bring him back. And he was due to perform surgery that morning. He was a surgeon, and Bill was looking at him when he got dumped in. He stayed up most of the night, gave him little sips of whiskey throughout the night, trying to taper him off. And then that morning gave him 2 bottles of beer on the way to the hospital. And Dr. Bob went in to perform this operation, which he did. And that was his last drink. And that was the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous, June 10th, 1935. Bill and Ann Smith were waiting at home for Bob to come back from the surgery. And the whole day's gone. He's not back. They're starting to get worried that maybe he went back out. And along about dusk, he comes in, and he looked wonderful. He looked better than he ever looked. And they said, "How'd the surgery?" "Oh, the surgery went wonderful." "Well, where have you been?" He said, "I got through with the surgery, and it suddenly dawned on me that there's all these people around town that I don't want to see because I've done things to them. And I just been making amends all day. And I went around and saw all these people and told them I was sorry for this or that. And now I feel like $1 million. And so he just, without realizing it, had been out doing steps 8 and 9, which hadn't been invented yet, and felt wonderful about it. So they started a little Oxford meeting in some people, the Williams, Henry and Clarice Williams, who were very wonderful to the early alcoholics in Akron, Ohio. And after a few months, Bill went back to New York, and he got a little group together. It wasn't called AA. It was just an Oxford group that was kind of specializing in looking for drunks. So there would be some non-alcoholics and alcoholics talking spiritual principles that the Oxford group had. And then another group got started in Cleveland. And this went on for a couple of years. In 1937, Bill came back out to Akron to visit with Dr. Bob and talk about what's going on. And they sat in the living room, and Bill and Bob said, "How many people sober, how many people do you think we have sober with real sobriety? 6 months, 8 months, a year, so that, we know that they've got a handle on this." And they counted up, it was somewhere around 35. in the country. And that was enough to convince them that they had indeed found this wonderful solution for alcoholics, and that they ought to do something about getting it out to all the millions of alcoholics that were still suffering. There was just this crusade mentality that was taking over mostly Bill, but Dr. Bob also. So they sat down and started talking, well, what can we do? What would be the thing? And Bill immediately took over. And he said, well, it's clear to me what needs to be done. So this stuff of going around word of mouth, that isn't going to make it. It's going to take years just to get out of Akron. We got to speed this up. And what I think we need are paid missionaries. Kind of like the way the church spreads all over the world. They send these missionaries all over the place. So if we're going to have paid missionaries, we got to have dough. We got to have a lot of money. So money is a very crucial thing to get this going. And we got to have places for these drunks to go, because the regular hospitals are getting tired of us. We throw up all over their hospitals. We don't pay our bills, and they really don't like us in there. So what we need are a bunch of drunk tanks. And matter of fact, he said we need a chain of drunk tanks. And chains were just starting in Wall Street, 5 and 10 cent stores and department stores and supermarkets. And anything that started with a chain caught on. Boom, 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 boom. It was all over. So Bill's applying that to AA. Chain of drunk tanks, a lot of paid missionaries, a bunch of dough. And we're going to have to put it in writing, what we've been doing. Up till this point, 2 years, not one word had been written down. It's kind of word of mouth. And we're just passing thing, and groups are doing it different. And so we're going to have to get some basic instructions, some kind of a book, and we'll put that together. So Dr. Bob's going, well, this sounds a little grandiose to me, but maybe you're right. And so they knew then that even in the early days, those two were not in charge. They didn't call it the group conscience, but they knew they had to run all their ideas by the rest of the people. So they assembled as many as they could in the Akron area for the organizational meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And they had about 15 or 16. Got them in there, and they said, this is where we are. We have found the answer. We're going to have to start moving this forward and getting it out. And here's the plan. We think that you guys could take a year off from your jobs. And the rich ones can subsidize the poor ones. And we'll give you the city of Milwaukee, and we'll give you Los Angeles, and we'll give you this. And we're going to send you out. We'll get some more guys. As soon as I get some more dough, we'll get some paid missionaries to go along, and we got to get them out. And then we got to get a chain of drunk tanks, and then we got to get a book. We got to put this all together. Well, as Bill looked out at the crowd in the room, he was not getting any sort of a reception that he liked. They were looking at him going, what are you talking about? We're doing this with no money. We just do this word of mouth. So he started, and he used this all the way for the next year and a half to anybody who said that we didn't want to follow his plan. He said, there's alcoholics dying by the hundreds within gunshot of this meeting. And at the rate we're going, we won't be out of Akron for 10 years. We got to get this thing moving, and we got to get it moving now. And that guilt made them all go, well, okay, I don't want to make people die. So by a narrow margin of about 1 or 2 votes, he got the go-ahead for the plan. And they said, Bill, you're from New York, that's where all the dough is, so you go back to New York and raise the dough. And so he had AA's blessing. Off he went to New York, and he was engaged in awesome money raising. And he went around to all the rich people that he knew, the different organizations, and came in with this big story. We found a new cure for alcoholism. We can save all the alcoholics in the world. And he got no money whatsoever. People would go, well, maybe I'll give to the Red Cross. And why should we scrape up the shavings on the floor? A couple of drunks. Drunks have sobered up before. Why should we do it now? He got no money, and he was just so discouraged. And he's talking to his brother-in-law, Leonard Strong, who was a doctor in New York, who stuck by him, one of the few family relatives that stuck by him all the way, helped pay for his bills in Towns Hospital and so on down. He was commiserating with Leonard, saying, I just can't get to talk to anybody. Nobody's interested. And Leonard said, well, I had a friend who had a cousin who worked for John D. Rockefeller Foundation. Would you like me to call him? And Bill said, yeah, I haven't been there yet, the Rockefeller Foundation. He said, well, I'll give him a call. And he called up a gentleman named Willard Richardson, who remembered Leonard Strong. He said, Leonard, oh yeah, I'd love to come on up, love to see you. What's it all about? Well, I've got a brother-in-law who thinks he's found a cure for alcoholism. He'd like to come up and talk to you about it. So come on up. So Bill's riding in the elevator up in the Rockefeller building, and he's going, man, I'm getting near the dough now. This is working great. And he gets in there, and it turns out that Mr. Richardson is Rockefeller's personal secretary, personal advisor. He's the closest guy to John D. there is. And he listens to this story. He says, my God, this is exactly what our founder. Would you like to come back and talk to some of our board of directors? People, the head of churches and engineering companies, big shots in New York. Oh, yes, I'd love to. Well, we'll set up a luncheon. You can come and talk. So he came and talked to these gentlemen, and they all agreed that this was absolutely wonderful. As a matter of fact, they said, we're going to send somebody out to Akron to investigate. So they sent one of the men out, talked to Dr. Bob, went around to the hospital and the AA groups and saw all that was in. They put together this big report for Mr. Rockefeller and took it in to him. And 2 or 3 weeks later, Mr. Rockefeller finished reading it and called Mr. Richardson in and said, I read this, and he said, I am very stirred by this organization. I think it is something that is going to change the whole world. But I think money will spoil it. I think money would ruin it. He said, you say these guys are strapped for cash, I'll put $3,000 in the Riverside Church in the special account, and they can draw on it and see if that can't get them by, but I think money will ruin the whole thing. Well, Bill and Dr. Bob started drawing on that, and they paid the mortgage down on Dr. Bob's house, and the money was going fast, and Bill didn't agree with John D. anyway, and he kept commiserating with this group of advisors that he had, and they said, well, Bill, you could form your own foundation. And he said, all right, so that's what they did. They formed the Alcoholic Foundation to go raise money for Alcoholics Anonymous. And the next year, they went out and he raised no money. Zero. And he just got so exasperated at the end of that time that he decided to shift the focus. He had put together 2 chapters of a book, and he would use that in his pitch. It's his story and more about alcoholism. And he would use it in his pitch when he was going in trying to raise money. Well, here, you can read this. You'll get a rough idea of what this is about. And at that point, he decided to shift the focus to the book as a way of raising money. And he stopped all the fundraising activities and started zeroing in on the book. And we'll go to the book next week, from the book till the period of about 1950 when the traditions came in. But that's sort of the background of the initial inertia for Alcoholics Anonymous, and we'll find out in the Rockefeller visits later on and all the things that happened, that there was an invisible hand that was working in the background to make sure that this organization never got any money. And as you know, Bill saw the wisdom of this later on and came up with the tradition that not only were we not going to raise any money, but we weren't going to take any money, and we were going to refuse any money whatsoever. So enough about the history now. The rest of the time here, let me just talk about our third step of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is 12 and 12 that I've had for a long time, and I just keep it up here to make me feel secure. We talked about coming into AA and shifting from our mind from a material mindset and the rules that govern living in the material world and moving over into the spiritual principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, and what a transition that is, and how lucky we are because we are powerless over alcohol. See, the disease of alcoholism puts us in the correct frame of mind to get spiritual, which is beaten. That's the best way. When you read, William James is one of the authors that Bill talks about, and it's in the big book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and that was the first psychologist that we had, and he was the father of American psychology, and he wrote the book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he talks about, as he studied religious or spiritual transformations, where somebody went from being all messed up to, wow, life is great. And he found that almost 100% of the time, that what all these people had in common in this country, in Asia, in Europe, wherever he studied, was they hit some kind of a crisis that drove them to the bottom of despair, and from that they came up with a whole different way of looking at life. And Bill writes about that in the first step in the 12 and 12. We become as open-minded as only the dying can become. So our first step, where we say we're powerless over alcohol, is the doorway into spirituality for us drunks, is to see that it's foolish for us to keep deluding ourselves that we're going to be able to drink and somehow be successful and it's not going to happen anymore. And if you feel that way, then you just keep on drinking, and we get beaten down even lower, and then we get an open mind. So the open mind does not come from an intellectual process. It comes from a beating administered by alcohol. And it's just like it goes, you got an open mind yet? No. You have an open mind yet? No. And you all know what you were doing to yourself. Bam! You puking blood. You get an open mind? No. But eventually, you finally just went, yeah, I can't take this anymore. That's the beginning of an open mind. So we get this, all right, can somebody get me out of this? Yeah, I'm from AA. Follow me. I don't like AA. Okay, stay there. Okay, I'll go to AA. It's like there's no other choice. There's no option. You want to stay there puking or go to AA? So that's why we're so lucky. We just get driven down where we're willing to follow somebody else's advice. And we come here and we've talked into totally surrendering. You've got to be powerless, not semi-powerless. Look at it. Get totally honest, because if you can surrender into that first step, the rest of AA, you'll have a wonderful time. You won't be debating it all the time. You won't have 6 months sobriety and go, I wonder if I'm really an alcoholic. Well, maybe I'm not. Maybe I am. God, it'll drive you crazy. So this total surrender goes, I'm here. This is it for me. What's the deal? I got to do this, and it's hard. At least you're trudging the road instead of debating whether you want to trudge the road. So that first step is so essential. And then last week we were talking about, now having beaten us down into surrender, you tell us that we're going to come to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. And we talked about how by default we had to believe in this because there was no other way out. And we saw other people in AA, and we saw their lives transformed, and it's a program of attraction. We don't promote anything. We have no AA higher power. You're going to find one. That'll be yours. I found one. That's mine. What the steps are techniques so that you'll be in touch with something that you will call your higher power. You can name it God. You can name it Holy Spirit, the Spirit of the universe, whatever you want. But you'll know what it is by the awareness that you have of it. It won't be a historical figure. It can be. You may go back to your childhood religion and find that it comes alive, and it's wonderful. But that's individual. That's not AA. As we said last week, AA does not try to convince anybody of the existence of God. We specialize in convincing you of the need for God. And once you understand the need for God, and that's where it's in that second step. If you have these symptoms, and if you can't stop drinking, you may be suffering from an illness that only a spiritual experience can fix. What a strange disease. You have a disease that only a spiritual experience can fix. And that's what we have. There's never been anything that lays a glove on alcoholism except AA, which is a spiritual experience. So as we come to believe this and allow this to come into our lives, we come to this third step, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. And there's this wonderful prayer in the Big Book which says, and for many of us, we symbolize the third step by reading this very often with our sponsor. And I suppose a great percentage will find that they hold hands with their sponsor to symbolize the fact that I want to make a big effort to turn my life over to a higher power. So, and then we read these few words together. God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help. Of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life, may I do thy will always. And it's just a wonderful choice of words to symbolize what we're trying to do by making this decision to turn our will and our lives over the care of God. Wonderful. We all go, gee, that's a great idea, making a decision, turn my will and my life over. And our ego goes, yeah, oh, it's a great idea, but let's not rush into this. I mean, think it through. You're going to tilt your will, your life, over to a higher power. So now you're driving your car, somebody pulls out in front. Are you going to swerve out of the way? You're going to wait for God to swerve out of the way. You got to keep some control. I mean, our egos are awesome. And they just get in there. So we begin by turning our drinking problem over to a higher power called AA. A lot of people have no problem doing that. As a matter of fact, that's what Bill writes about in the 12 and 12. Yes, with respect to alcohol, I can turn my life over. There's more experience about alcoholism here in AA than I have, so I have no problem turning my alcohol problem over to AA. But the rest of my life, all the other decisions, I think it'd be better if I keep those. I just don't. And then there's that great sentence, if I turned over everything, I'll be like the hole in the donut. Who will I be? And I remember thinking about this later on in the inventory stuff. You know, it's like, if I got rid of my character defects, who would I be? Because I am my character defects, you know. I don't have any other identity than my character defects. So who would I be, you know? It's kind of scary to be thinking about that. So there's a lot of resistance to this. And one of the things that came through to me was the fact that other people, there were guys just like me, who stood up and said, yeah, I was this, and I was a macho this, and a fighter pilot, and blah, 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 blah. And now, I just rely on God, and it's 100% better. I'm going, it is? I mean, it just, you know, it was like hearing other people saying this made me, okay. And in our literature, Bill says, all we have to do is make a beginning. Just a beginning, the smallest beginning. Just say, okay, I'm going to try. And we have to understand that the third step, we do not get anything turned over. We made a decision to turn it over. I tried to do that when I really got excited about this. I said, you know, that's right. They're right. I should do this. And I always go to my bedroom when I'm going to do spiritual things. So I go up there and I go, okay, it's turn it over moment. Maybe I'll light a couple of candles and a couple of deep breaths and just something like, from now on, God, you got it. And blew the candles out. Come down the steps. Told my 6 kids and my disbelieving wife, you got a new person here. I just turned over my life to God. And one of my kids said, Dad, I lost my lunch allowance money. What the hell you goddamn money? So I just assumed that God hated him too. So it's not turned over. And so we're making a beginning here. We're making a decision. But this is a huge decision, and we really got to wrestle with it, and we really got to go with all of this. The biggest thing is, what does that mean? What do you mean I'm turning my life? I mean, what is that? I mean, I have a hard time believing this. This is a big stretch. You know what I mean? I'm out there, I'm trusting vodka. Now I'm going to trust something I can't see, I don't know anything about. And various things were pointed out to me. It was pointed out to me that when I was about 12 years old and I joined the Boy Scouts, and I think in probably the first year we're there, and then one night the Boy Scout master comes up and says, okay, tonight I'm going to teach you kids about what happens, what you do if you're in the woods and you're lost. You're totally lost. You have no idea how to get out of there, and if you don't get out, you're going to starve to death. And if you make a wrong turn, you're just going to go in deeper. You're going to blah, blah, blah. Here's a compass, and he passed out all the compasses there to the thing. And we're all going, oh, yeah, look at this, and pop it open and all that. And he said, see that little needle in there? Yeah. See that needle? Well, let me tell you about that. There's a big rock up at the North Pole, and that needle points right at that rock. So it'll always point to the north. Once you know north, you can just take this map thing, bing, immediately. Hey, I have to head. Look right on your compass, a heading of 030. I'm out of here. I'm on a road hitchhiking. I'm getting some food. I don't remember sitting there when the scoutmaster said that and go, a big rock at the North Pole. You want me to buy that crap? A big rock at the North Pole? I want to go up and see the rock at the North Pole. I'm not... You want me to risk my life on a freaking Mickey Mouse watch and a rock at the North Pole? No way, Jose. I didn't do that. I said, hey, that's terrific. Stuck in my pocket. I said, man, if I'm ever out there, take this thing out, I'll risk my life on that. 1 minute briefing by the scoutmaster. Then, however many years later, 10, I'm in the Marine Corps, I'm in flight school, we're going through this, and we're doing all these various things, going to carrier, bombing, blah, 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 and then they go, all right, now we're going to show you how to fly into an airport between two mountains when it's totally fogged in and cloudy and you can't see anything. And if you just deviate slightly to either side, you fly right into a mountain and you die. I go, wow, well, how do we do this? You don't have to worry about a damn thing. We got a radio beacon down there. There's an invisible beam that comes up. Beep, 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 beep. Right into your plane. And all you do is dial it in and pop, pop, and you just go bing, bada, bing, bada, bing, and you listen. And that was back when Radio Range was out. And you actually listen to the A and the N and the beam and all that. And when you get there, poof, there'll be the runway at the last second, and you'll be safe and everything will be wonderful. I didn't raise my hand in the back of the room. Oh, come on, a visible beam coming up into my plane. I'm going out in good weather. I'm going to see this beam. I want to go look at it and all that. I said, how do you dial in the beam? That's what I said. How do you dial in the beam? Get into AA and they go, boy, are you lucky. You alcoholic, you're worried about how to do it. No. There's this wonderful higher power. Many of us call this God. If you follow these steps, you will remove all of the barriers that are preventing contact with this, and this force will guide you through life. Oh, you got to be kidding. You want me to buy into the fact that there's a God? I bought into the compass, I bought into the invisible beam, but I ain't buying into God. That's my ego, because this is too much. This isn't just some little narrow area of my life. This is the entire thing. I said, well, I don't know. It sounds good, something I might do later in life. I'd always had this plan. When I was an early Catholic, about 6, I had this plan, screw off until you're 89. Go to confession off your deathbed. You go into heaven with all these people who had no fun for their whole life. So I said, we can wait a little on this. I don't need to be turning my life over. So then they started talking about, well, one of the big reasons to turn it over is you'll probably get drunk if you don't. Ooh, well, now let me take another look at that. And that's all over Big Book 12 and 12. One of the main reasons for doing this. And then the second reason, my sponsor pointed out, you know why you really ought to turn your life over to God? Why? Because your way stinks. Your plan for living is absurd. It's the worst I've ever seen anywhere of anybody. You could turn your life over to a gorilla in the zoo with a dartboard, yes, no, and would be way ahead if you stayed in charge. Oh, yeah. So then he started focusing in, and it's all over, I think. Self-centeredness is the root of our problem. Self-centeredness is the root of our problem. And the more I thought about that, and that wonderful discussion in the big book about the actor, and he's on stage, and if only everybody would follow his instructions, it would be a wonderful world. And there's a sentence in there that says, even when he is kind, is he not self-serving? And I started thinking about that, and I'm going, I didn't know what being kind was. I knew what acting kind was. I saw people, they would be kind to somebody, and then that person would be nice back to them. So I saw it as a way of getting something. And that's what it talks about in the big book. It says, we're so self-centered that everything we're doing has an ulterior motive. It's to gain us. So even when we're being nice to somebody, they can see that we're just being nice because we want to get something. And so we haven't got a clue what being kind is. We know what it looks like. You say certain things and smile and do all those things, but it doesn't come from the heart. It can't. The self-centeredness has no room for kindness. Self-centeredness, everything's coming from here. And so I said, well, you're right. I'm totally self-centered. I've always been that way. So that's what the program is going to do. It's going to help you to stop being self-centered. And I said, well, I think I can just make a decision. I am self-centered, and I'm going to fix it. And remember, that was the self-centeredness talking. How does a self-centered person become unself-centered? Well, I could stand over there, and that would be a different center. And then I started thinking, what is the opposite of self-centeredness? What is the opposite of self-centeredness? The only thing I can come up with is unself-centered. That's really helpful. That sort of clarifies it, right? Anybody that's new? Oh, unself-centered. Yeah, write that down. That's And the answer is, we become God-centered. And that's what the program is designed to do. And God is the real center. I think I talked about this before, that in the early days when they thought the Earth was the center of the solar system, but everything was screwed up, didn't make sense, and then they said, no, it's the sun, and then all the formulas worked and everything, oh yeah, that's right. But they almost killed the early astronomers who came up with that, because in order to shift from the Earth being the center to the sun being center, you'd have to change your mind. You have to change all these ideas you've been saying year after year after year. And so they would execute these astronomers rather than changing my mind and going through all that. Well, this is what's going on when we decide to become God-centered. Everything's going to be different. There won't be anything that's the same. And one of the things that was very deep inside of me was, man, if I buy into this God stuff, then I will have no excuse for not sinning. See, I used to sin because there was no God and people are powerless over that. So I had a way of leading Bobby badass life with no guilt. And this made me nervous that if I bought into the God-centered idea, but there was no other choice. And I started thinking about this, and I talked to my sponsor about it, and I said, well, then how am I going to have this happen? How could this happen? He said, that's where the rest of the steps come in. When you make a commitment, you are now signing up. It's like the third step is like making a decision to go get a law degree. You just decided for about 7 years worth of work. You go undergraduate and go on to law school. That's the decision. Now you're going to go do the work so that it happens. And I made a decision that I was going to do whatever it took to have this happen. And I asked him, what is it that happens? What is it that happens? Does God show up and then I see him and I do this, or a flash or whatever? And he said, no. God's already inside of you. It's already there. Everything that you need is already there. It's blocked. You can't feel it. You can't get in touch with it. Your self-centeredness and your character defects have you totally blocked from this huge healing force that's inside of you. As soon as you take the actions in the other steps to open this channel, you will experience this wonderful force that's part of you. It is your higher power. It is your spirituality that's inside of you. And once it can flow out, you're going to see the world as you never saw it before. You're going to hit the jackpot. That's what this is all about, and that's what the rest of the steps are designed to do. That's what character did. We're talking about them next week, the inventory and sharing, and then constantly keeping the channel open, and then meditating to open it even wider so that we can have this awareness of our own selves. It's been there all along. Somebody told me way back when, you already are all that you can ever become. You just have to become aware of it. You are this wonderful, magnificent spiritual creature, but you can't get in touch with it yet. And a lot of us have that feeling inside that we really want to be better people. I want to be a better mother. I want to be this. And we were trying to live up to moral convictions without a higher power. And we talked about that last week, and that's very difficult. So here's how we get set free. We make this decision. It's a huge commitment to no longer run a life on self-will. We're going to remove character defects so that the noise of fear and resentment and anger and lust and greed and envy can be silenced, so we can hear the still small voice inside that'll serve as a navigational beacon for the rest of our lives. We will no longer have to figure life out. We can be guided. We will be guided into doing the next right thing. We won't have to have long-range plans. We can just live one day at a time, turning this long-distant future over to our higher power. And do you know what a freedom it is to take that pack off and pass it over where it ought to be and just be a servant for the day, knowing that nothing but the best is going to be given to you by your loving higher power. We're at the end of the time. We got to put the chair. I'll make the announcement. If you would help us stack the chairs. Is it just on this side or both sides? Both sides. And we got a great way to wrap it up with the Lord's Prayer for anybody who would take